Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Prize of Folly podcast. Tonight I'm joined by Keith Preston again. This is our eighth and final installment of our U.S. foreign policy series. Thanks for coming on, Keith. It's been a pleasure doing this with you. So one of the things we left off with was the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, I don't know if we covered the fall of the Soviet Union. I think we covered a little bit of it. Of course, while Ronald Reagan, some of his policy decisions contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the actual collapse took place on the watch of George Herbert Walker Bush. And one of the things that's interesting is the collapse of the Soviet Union and the beginnings of our active military involvement in the Middle East. Because there's some, from what I understand, the Soviets actually discouraged Saddam from a direct confrontation with the West. And it appears that in the first Gulf War, it was almost like a way to show off the whole Reagan buildup. There was a few things involved with the first Gulf War. Right, the first thing was we wanted to have a quick, easily winnable war so that the Vietnam syndrome could be, quote, cured. And a lot of pro-war sentiment was ginned up during 1990 against what was apparently a clear act of aggression by a third world dictator. And it also was a sense to show off what we could do to the Soviets. We could show off our new toys that Reagan had built up. And it was a complete slaughter for Saddam, but it was a carefully chosen fight. And the interesting thing is, I think there's very good reason to believe that the Iraq War is a kind of the first Iraq War was a farce all around. When Saddam's initial dispute with Kuwait was over oil. Kuwait was essentially tapping oil underneath the Iraqi border, and Saddam had an oil dispute with him, and they weren't listening. And he talked to the American ambassador, Aaron Glaspie, and he said basically, he hinted in pretty not so subtle ways that if Kuwait didn't get on board, he would become involved militarily in the region. And she gave a very cagey reply saying that some of the effect of intra-Arab conflict does not concern us. Then he takes that as a green light to go. And we had given green lights before to dictators to invade countries. We give a green light to Suharto to invade East Timor. We'd given a green light to the Turkish military junta who invaded Cyprus in 1973, 74. So something like that had happened multiple times before. So Saddam could be forgiven for thinking that we were giving him the same sort of extension. But then we immediately flipped around and said, you got to get out of there now, yesterday, basically, or we're going to attack you. And of course, Saddam could not have met the deadline. He had, 250,000 troops in Kuwait. We gave him like a week to get out. That just was not feasible. And so I kind of get the feeling there's the smell of a setup in order to showcase what we could do, and in some sense to scare the Soviets, much in the same way that the atom bomb was used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to scare the Soviets. And it's interesting to see how that begins right as the Soviet Union is actually collapsing in Western Europe. And another thing that we'll see continually in the War on Terror is the color revolutions. The first color revolutions, which will become much more well known in 2011 with the Arab Spring, were the Velvet Revolutions in the 80s, funded by yours truly, George Soros. And he's usually the person pinned for the Arab Spring as well, and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004. But that sort of technique of overthrowing governments was also used successfully to topple these Eastern Bloc countries in the late 80s, early 90s. And so we see that the stage is already being set for the tools and the methodology of intervention that we will later see throughout the Middle East being set up as the Soviet Union is disintegrating, and in some sense successfully used against the last vestiges of Soviet power. And then the other thing we see is with the collapse of the Soviet Union, this idea that history had reached its terminus, that it had, to quote Francis Fukuyama, history had ended. In 1989, he wrote an essay, The End of History. 3 years later, he wrote the book, The End of History and the Last Man, where he expounds on that. Now, by the end of history, he specifically means that liberal democracy and capitalism are the final stage of human societal development. There's no possible means of improving upon that model. And that while there might be threats that arise to that model, that's just going to be the de facto for the rest of human civilization, as long as that goes. Um, and this is all based off the euphoria of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which very few people had believed what happened. And for the 90s, people, we have Clinton's brief intervention in Iraq with the airstrikes to distract from the Monica Lewinsky scandal, his intervention in Serbia, and I think to some extent in Haiti. But again, these are relatively trivial affairs, and we have the exploding economy of the 90s. Of course, that bubble gets popped in the early 2000s, the dot-com bubble 2001, and then later again in 2007. But there's this kind of euphoria, and this is sort of what happens when one nation grappling with another nation in a period of struggle overcomes its opponent. It thinks that somehow it's done something new and different. We kind of saw this at the end of World War One, where the Allied powers said, "Oh, we have the League of Nations. There's a whole new world out there. Everything's different. Everything's changed. Justice and light have beaten the forces of darkness." But of course, after World War One, we realized that wasn't the case. There was the Great Depression, then the rise of Hitler and communism, and then the same after the Cold War. We had this period where there was no clear threat, but it was almost like two things were at work here. There were potential challengers that were not quite ready to challenge us directly yet, even in the 90s, and then also this desire to find a replacement for the Soviet Union. In the 90s, I don't think it was quite as strong as it is now. But beginning in 2001 with the attack on 9/11, Islam and Islamic terrorism sort of was a surrogate for the Soviets in a way that would justify the U.S. military-industrial complex. As you pointed out, it just looks easy. It just needs one more enemy to satisfy its own existence. But at the end of the day, though, it's really a poor shadow of a threat to compare to Russia, or the Soviet Russians. They have nowhere near the military or nuclear assets that the Soviets had at their heyday. And we made much the same mistake with the Russians that the Allies made with the Germans after World War One. The assumption that a great power could perpetually be kept down was an illusion that we should have had no illusions about. After World War One, Germany was kept down for about 20 years, and then it comes back. Well, Russia was kept down for about 20 years, but then with Putin, it comes back. So we should have learned the lessons from World War I and II, but we didn't. And so while we're trying to make new threats in the Middle East, we then end up also offending Russia, presuming falsely that it will never recover its strength. And now it's pushing back. We can get into some of that later. But generally speaking, there was this, unwarranted euphoria that the West had won, capitalism had won, democracy had won, and there'd be no need to change. Everything was just set in place. And as we will talk about later, that really wasn't the case. So what are your thoughts, Keith, on the end of history in the 1990s?
Well, as you pointed out, Francis Fukuyama had an essay called "The End of History" that I believe he turned into a book. And as you pointed out, his thesis was that the Western model of liberal democracy was the final stage in human political evolution. That this is the most human beings could ever achieve in terms of their political and economic institutions. And it was just a matter of waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. The Western liberal model was as good as it's ever going to get. And now we just have to bring all the world up to our standards. And I think that idea was one of the main things that steered the neocons towards this idea of a revolution for global democracy. The neocon ideology, the neoconservatives' ideology is that the United States and other Western nations should spread this Western model of liberal democracy and capitalism to the rest of the world by armed force if possible, or if necessary. And the idea behind that, at least the theory, is that will make the world a more peaceful place in the long run, because if all of these other countries around the world adopt the Western model, then there's not going to be any more wars, because Western liberal democratic nations do not go to war with each other. Another idea that's related to this is what's called democratic peace theory, which is the idea that democratic nations or democratic states do not make wars against one another. So, in other words, if the whole world had a liberal democratic government, um, or if every nation in the world had a liberal democratic government, then there would be no more wars between nations. Now, I think this is a really naive view of democratic governments. I mean, I can think of plenty of examples from history where democratically elected governments went to war with each other. I mean, a case in point would be the United States and the Confederate States of America. Now, I suppose by modern standards, those weren't democratic in the sense that they had slavery and women weren't allowed to vote and all of that. But they weren't traditional royal systems. They were elected republics. And they certainly had no problem going to war with each other. So that's a rather silly theory. The reason that there have been no wars between the European nations since World War II is because those nations were essentially disarmed. I mean, ever since World War II, the European nations have been essentially protectorates of the United States and NATO, and there is no NATO without the United States. I mean, NATO is the United States. It's the American European military arm. So that's a rather foolish theory. Now, as far as the idea of exporting liberal democracy to all of these other places, it is true that today, of about 200 nations around the world, we have about 2/3 of those, something like 125 of those, are liberal democracies, more or less by Western standards. And another 30 or so are semi-democratic. They're normally classified as semi-democratic. Russia is one of those. Um, so we do see that liberalism or democracy or democratic capitalism or whatever is becoming the dominant model around the world. However, at the same time, we also see states starting to disintegrate in many parts of the world. And Bill Lind and some of the other fourth generation warfare theorists have written about that quite a bit, talking about how increasingly we see regions of the world where the state either never took root in the first place or the state that existed previously has fallen apart. And in return, we see the rise of terrorists and guerrillas and militias and all of these other pirates and all kinds of other things. We've seen a proliferation of that in places like Africa, in the Middle East, quite a bit since the end of the Cold War, where we see traditional states falling apart in favor of these kinds of these situations that are de facto civil war. That's one thing. Also, we're seeing the rise of non-state organizations that are making war against states, terrorist organizations, Al Qaeda, and groups like that being the most obvious example. And then within the context of liberal democratic states, we see something of an existential crisis brewing because, largely because I think of globalization as well as immigration. The nation state model, the model of the nation state with a liberal democratic capitalist political and economic system is something that comes out of the 19th century. The earliest modern nation states were originally parts of royal empires and dynasties, and then when those started to decline, you started to see the emergence of these independent nations, which were largely organized on the basis of language, people that had a common language or a common cultural background. And you also saw people scattered into different territories that were starting to unify. Nationalism is thought of as a right-wing idea or concept today, but in reality, 19th century nationalism was part of the rise of liberalism and socialism during that same time period. Liberalism, democracy, socialism, and nationalism all started to emerge in the 19th century as dominant trends. And what came out of 19th century nationalism is the nation state system and the idea of sovereign nations where you have a unified government for people with the same language and culture and all of that. And that's how we got Germany, that's how we got Italy, that's how we got a unified France, and all of those things. What's happened now is that model became the dominant model in the 20th century, but it's starting to recede because borders between nations are starting to become a lot more porous because of globalization, because the economy increasingly extends across national boundaries. Also, we start to see migration taking place on a much more rapid pace. Now, some of that is economics driven as well. I mean, globalization breeds migration and also advancements in communications and travel technology and all of those things. So that's having the effect now of eroding the cultural homogeneity that comprise these traditional nation states, where more and more you have people under the same roof once again, just like you did in the old royal systems. You have people under the same political roof that don't speak the same language or don't share the same cultural background or don't share the same religion or really have very little in common in terms of their core civic or political values. So the nation state system and liberal democracy in the West is undergoing an existential crisis, even as it's being extended to other places. And at the same time, the state is also being challenged by non-state organizations and by simply the erosion of identifiable state authority in some parts of the world. And now it's interesting to see how we've gone from this situation where the international order was dominated by rivalries between states, between the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies, towards a system where we have a hegemonic state, the United States, and its various partners and allies and satellites and so forth. And then that's being challenged by what are now rising states, rising formerly third world states, as well as Russia, and also by non-state organizations as well. So it's really it's really something that was unanticipated, completely unanticipated when it came to this whole end of history theory. Even in Russia and China, while they have certainly adopted the global economy, they're both G20 nations. It's also true that both of those have resisted the Western model to a large degree. China completely so. They've remained a one-party communist dictatorship, even while they've adapted capitalist economics. And then Russia is a semi-democratic country, but it has remained culturally very conservative. I mean, they haven't embraced gay marriage and all of that kind of stuff as well. And both of these now are once again challenging Western hegemony.
Yeah, exactly. One thing you mentioned earlier was that this whole end of history sort of motivated the neoconservative movement and its desire to go on expeditions. And I think really the big, over the past 16 years, the really big global issue has been the war on terror. And beginning in 9/11, after the terror attack, that was more of a pretext for the actual invasion. The project for the new American century, put together by the think tank of these neoconservative individuals. The whole point was that they were going to do regime change in strategically located countries in order to maintain U.S. democratic capitalist hegemony. And one of the things that you see here is that it was so quickly ready to go. Like, they're going to go in the lead up to Iraq. Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. Saddam is harboring terrorists, this, that, and the other thing. And it was already ready to go. And they just, the Bush administration with their allies in Europe, like Blair, and I think Spain and Poland, what they call the coalition of the willing, they geared up to first invade Afghanistan and then 2 years later invade Iraq. Afghanistan, one could have theoretically made a stronger case. If memory serves, I think even Ron Paul voted for U.S. intervention in Afghanistan because it was seen as a terrorist state. Though also I think Ron Paul also advocated that since these were terrorists, it wasn't an act of war, it was an act of terror, and working more with the international community and possibly using non-state actors like mercenaries or PMCs would have been a preferable way to handle the Taliban or their terrorist allies. But with Iraq, though, it was much less clear, at least from a sort of voting person's perspective, what the connection was. And the connection was not so much to terror, because when we invaded Iraq, we from what I can remember, that was so long ago, we didn't really find much evidence that Saddam was colluding with terrorists. And while Saddam had chemical weapons, he used them against the Kurds in Iran in the 80s. From what I could tell, especially after the U.S. occupation, we didn't actually find them. I remember when I used to watch the news, you'd be like, "Oh yeah, they went to Syria. We didn't have they couldn't find the weapons." So like and I think even Bush later on publicly stated, "Yeah, it wasn't even about the weapons in the first place." And I'm like, "Well, that's awfully convenient after we've invaded and done all this destruction." One of the other things that's interesting about the Iraq War is not only that it was a part of this broader project for a new American century to maintain American hegemony, to fight terrorists, quote, over there, so we don't fight them over here, and to use it as a test case for nation building and democracy. Uh, we also saw in the early days of the invasion this idea that warfare had fundamentally changed, sort of like the utopian thought after World War I, with tanks and bombers fundamentally changing warfare. You could just throw out the old rules. People like Rumsfeld with it was information centric warfare, I think they were talking about. We had these really light, fast forces just go around zipping around with their computers and using precision weapons to target enemy forces and eliminate them. And of course, what we saw was with the coalition that attacked Saddam in '91 was roughly, I think, 500,000 men, and about half of that was Americans. When with the and we had a much broader base of coalition support. France, if I'm not, it was also deployed in the first Gulf War. In the second Gulf War, though, far fewer troops. I think it was 250,000 total, of which 150,000 were American. And of course, we couldn't hold down the country, and that's what led to all the instability. And in that power vacuum, where the Saddam regime has been toppled, and the U.S. occupying forces were unable to control the regions, ex Iraqi soldiers became, militia leaders and started, what became the insurgency against the U.S. forces. And that was only really sort of gotten under control with the surge. So it really just shows you not only how aggressive these people were, but how incompetent they were. To go in Iraq to conquer the whole country with with roughly half the manpower of what the Kuwait coalition used in '91, to hold down a whole country, whereas the mandate in '91 was much more narrow, just to drive the Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. And the thing that's very telling is in 1993, not Rumsfeld, I forgot his name, Dick Cheney, he pointed out that, well, why didn't we topple Saddam? He said in 1993, because we had no alternative. Because if we toppled Saddam, the Shiites would take over Iraq and Iran would dominate the region. Now, that's essentially what's happened now. So the question is, if they knew that in '93 and they knew that in 2003, 10 years later, what was the real motivation for it? Because clearly they told us what would happen, like they had a crystal ball in 1993. And the same people that told us that in '93 told us to invade in 2003, and everything they predicted 10 years before the invasion came true. And that really is kind of the big question mark. What was the real objective? Because what they do hadn't changed in the 20 years in between this current state of affairs and what they predicted. So there's a lot of ways you can look at it, but I think part of it is they want to destabilize the Middle East, because the current advantage of doing so is, in part, it creates a kind of 1984 dystopia. We're a constant war, right? The war on terror is the perfect, was it Pacifica versus Oceania versus Eurasia? We're all at war all the time, always giving up civil liberties, but we're never actually winning the war. There's no way to actually declare victory and say the war's over. Okay, we're done, guys. Go home. Go back to normal. And I think part of that is the agenda, is that you can, in democratizing the world and destabilizing the Middle East, you also create this feedback loop where at home you can suspend civil liberties with things like the Patriot Act in order to justify as a war security measure in a war that really has no discernible objectives. What are your thoughts on that, Keith?
Well, the whole backstory to the war in Iraq is interesting. You have to go all the way back to the 80s, because during the 1980s, Iraq and Iran were at war with each other. It was a very large scale war that lasted for about 8 years. Almost immediately after the war, after the Khomeini revolution in Iran in 1979, Saddam came to power in Iraq that same year as well. and Saddam almost immediately invaded Iran because he wasn't happy with this idea of having this revolutionary Shia regime next door. And not only that, but the majority of Iraq's population are also Shia, many of whom were sympathetic to the Iranian Revolution. It's interesting that when this was going on, when Saddam invaded Iran in 1980, that the United States supported Iraq's war effort and actually provided weapons and other kinds of support to Iraq. And I used to see television news reports in the United States in the 1980s about the Iran-Iraq war, praising Iraq as the good guys, fighting off these bad guy Shiite fundamentalist terrorists in Iran. Because back then it was the Iranians who were the public enemy number one, because of the Iranian Revolution and then the seizure of some Americans at an embassy and keeping them hostage for over a year and things like that. Then all of a sudden, after the Cold War was over or coming to an end, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait and annexes Kuwait. And prior to the invasion of Kuwait, most Americans had never even heard of Saddam Hussein. I mean, they vaguely knew there was this country called Iraq. They vaguely knew that maybe Iraq and Iran had been at war. But ordinary people had never really even heard of Saddam Hussein. He's this new guy, this new bad guy that appears on the scene, and he was demonized in the media as this insane Hitler-like character. I remember this really well, and the public really went for this. A lot of Americans were like, "Wow, there's this crazy guy that has nuclear weapons and he's invading countries and wants to take over the whole world." Someone they had never even heard of a few weeks earlier. And so that was the whole lead up to the war in Iraq. The first war in Iraq in 1990 was really built up in the press, and the American government of President George H.W. Bush kept throwing out one reason after another why they were sending troops, because they did send 500,000 troops to Iraq, to Saudi Arabia for the purpose of driving Iraq out of Kuwait. And I remember the Bush administration kept throwing out all of these different justifications. At one point, they're saying they're trying to end human rights abuses in Iraq, or they're trying to keep the Iraqis from invading Saudi Arabia, or they're trying to prevent Iraq from gaining nuclear weapons. At one point, the Secretary of State, James Baker, actually said, "Well, we're just there to protect American jobs." It was almost like they were just trying to throw out whatever justification they could find for this and see whatever got saluted when they ran it up the flagpole. And then in the build-up to the war, the first Gulf War in 1991, it was in early 1991. As you were saying, it was a very brief war. It was fought using a lot of air power and things like that. The Iraqi army was totally decimated. Iraq performed very poorly in that war. And it was widely hailed as this great victory for the United States and this great victory over terrorism. And I remember hearing a lot of people saying, "Yeah, this is going to be the end of terrorism in the Middle East now, because we showed them we can." We're not going to take that or whatever. I mean, including sophisticated people were saying these kinds of things, not just people off the street. And of course, the end of the first Gulf War led to a situation where Iraq was basically under occupation for the rest of the time after that. I mean, maybe not formally, but they had the disarmament program with the UN, this disarmament program. They also had the creation of the no-fly zone, and there was repeated American and Western bombing carried out in Iraq all throughout the 1990s. And then when the build-up to the second Iraq War in 2003 started, it was the same thing. It was like the administration of President George W. Bush was throwing out one justification after another for this particular war, and nothing ever really seemed to stick. It was, well, Saddam Hussein has nuclear weapons. Saddam Hussein is funding terrorism. Saddam Hussein oppresses his own peoples. All of these same things that were being said in 1991. And as you pointed out, it it was a similar build-up, but not nearly as large. It was only about half the military force that they had in 1991. Now, I think the Americans were believing that they could win very easily. They were probably thinking that the Iraqi army and society had been decimated by the war, the first war in 1991, as well as by the sanctions that took place that were imposed on Iraq and had remained in place for 12 years. And those are important as well, because there was the incident where Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State under President Clinton, she was interviewed on American television saying that the 500,000 deaths that had been caused by the sanctions that had been imposed on Iraq were worth the cost. And that interview was played all over the Middle East. And it really fueled a lot of anti-American sentiment in the Middle East at the time. And when September 11th came, the evidence indicates that at the Pentagon, plans were drawn up for actually overturning the governments of, I think it was 7 different nations. It was Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, Libya, Syria, Somalia, the Sudan. I don't remember the exact ones. I think it was roughly that collection that I just named. And Afghanistan was the first one, because that's where the Taliban were located, who were aligned with Osama bin Laden, and they allowed him to set up camp in Afghanistan. And then Iraq was the next one that they went after. Paul Wolfowitz, who was the Deputy Secretary of State, of Defense at the time under Donald Rumsfeld, said they did Iraq first or second after Afghanistan because it was doable. Those are his words. It was doable, probably meaning it was the easiest one to sell from a political standpoint. Of course, Colin Powell went in front of the United Nations General Assembly and made a fraudulent presentation claiming that Iraq was building weapons of mass destruction and things like that. And probably from that presentation, it looked like he was probably put up to that by the neocons in the Bush administration. And he was called out on it very extensively by the French foreign minister during that particular exchange. But what I remember about the war in Iraq in 2003 is that when they went into Iraq, you had people like Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney saying that this was going to be a cakewalk, that this is just going to be an easy, simple invasion. We're just going to go in, get rid of Saddam Hussein. The people are going to welcome us. The Iraqi people are going to welcome us as liberators, and the war is going to pay for itself because the oil revenues that are going to be generated by the oil trade and all these kinds of things. They just had this really fantastical view about how wonderful the results of this war were going to be. And then there was the neocons are turning out a lot of propaganda about how this was going to be the end. It was very similar to World War I. It was going to be the war to end all wars. And you had guys like David Frum, the neocon writer, who actually wrote a book called An End to Evil, saying we're going to get rid of all these bad guy governments around the world and have worldwide global democracy and capitalism, and it's going to be a new dawn. And of course, it didn't turn out that way. And what the results of this were entirely predictable. It was entirely predictable that if you went and dislodged the government of a nation that had all of these fractious internal elements, like the Kurds, like the Shia, like the Sunni, like all the different tribes and clans and things like that, that what you would have in the place of Saddam's dictatorship would be a civil war, that the Iranians would gain a great deal of influence in the region, that the Kurds would start seeking independence. And that's more or less what happened. That's more or less what has happened in Iraq since then. In fact, if anything, it's been even worse than what was predicted, because we've also seen the rise of ISIS. We've seen remnants of the former Saddam regime, the Baathists, as forming an alliance with jihadis now, which wasn't the case before. Saddam Hussein had always kept that out of the government of Iraq, and had kept a lid on that within Iraq itself. But then out of the remnants of all of that has emerged ISIS, and now we're in a situation where previous to 2001, we had the Taliban in power in Afghanistan, and now they've more or less made a comeback. And then prior to 2003, we had Saddam Hussein, in power in Iraq, and now ISIS is essentially, you know, become a major threat in that region as well. So it's almost it's pretty safe to say that there's really been no improvement at all. I mean, it's really the same situation that existed 15 years ago.
It's even arguably worse because for the Shiite and Christian minorities in those areas, they're getting massacred in Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. But another thing, too, that needs to be pointed out is while the neoconservatives pushed a more muscular form of a democratization in U.S. imperialism, there was certainly, at least at the time of Bush, because the Democrats had not been as directly interventionist, that they were somehow not a part of this broader project. But if one looks back at Bill Clinton and his escapades in places like Somalia, Kosovo, Haiti, and his strikes was Operation Desert Fox in Iraq during the 90s to deflect from the Monica Lewinsky scandal. All of that was more of a kind of a soft power intervention. And you see this really well in the Obama administration. I'm pretty sure it was his his first term with Samantha Powers. She was kind of like almost like the Dick Cheney of the Obama administration. Her theory of democratic reform in the Middle East and the supporting of the Arab Spring, which I think began in Tunisia, but then spread to places like Libya and Egypt and Yemen and Syria and all throughout the Middle East. And that was another new dawn moment. The liberal media was like, it's a new, and the neocons were totally on board. You know, it's a new dawn, democracy everywhere. And of course, what does Egypt do? Egypt votes in the Islamic Brotherhood, which then causes a military coup to oust the Brotherhood. And now I think Egypt is just now returning to some sort of non-military government. Libya is a wreck. And Libya is it's extremely important here because there's a lot of things that happen from the fallout of Libya. What we know now from the Julian Assange WikiLeaks is that Hillary Clinton wanted to use Syria in much the same Libya in much the same way that the Roman generals of the Republic would use their conquests. It was a way to legitimate their domestic political careers, much like how Crassus would raise an army and invade Persia. Of course, he died in Persia, but much like Crassus, it backfired for Hillary as well. Libya was decisive in the election campaign of 2016, but not in the way she had intended. It was supposed to push her over the edge and get her elected, when in fact, with all these scandals, especially revolving around Benghazi, it ended up tipping it in favor of Donald Trump. But the other thing, too, is the current migrant crisis is the direct result of the Arab Spring. See, the only stable state in West Africa was Libya. Gaddafi, for all you could say about him, the Libyan state was really not that bad considering the neighboring states of West Africa. It had a functioning civil service, you had education, you had social services, you had electricity and things like that. It was basically working. And he was a relatively popular leader. And the other regions that were falling apart would those people would flee to Libya. And while they were in Libya, they would then make new lives for themselves. So Libya was like the last stable place for them to actually come to. But what happens is, when we topple that regime, there's nowhere for them to go. Libya is tearing itself apart, and so now they're going through Libya into Europe, which is causing a tremendous demographic problem. Within these hundreds of thousands of immigrants, there are small cadres of terrorists that sneak in, and they've committed a series of terrible attacks in Nice and Brussels and Paris and Cologne throughout Europe. And the Arab Spring in Syria led to a disastrous, ongoing 6-year civil war, which is, of course, what directly led to the birth of ISIS. And many of those Syrian refugees are also fleeing to Europe. And the Assad regime and the Gaddafi regime were dictatorships. Assad's father was well known for crushing the revolt in Homs with brutal military force, killing 20,000 people. But what you can say about his father, and even him in his early career, was it kept order. It was a stable country. Terrorism was kept in check. And most Syrians could make a quasi-decent living. Things were beginning to get better economically if not politically. Same goes in Libya. And this sort of soft revolutionary power, the sort of the good cop, bad cop, carrot on the stick kind of attitude. What Obama and Samantha Powers and Hillary Clinton have shown us is that they are just as imperialistic as the Bush Cheney Wolfowitz Rumsfeld regime. They just use soft power more, and arguably the results have been just as disastrous. I mean, if you compare the death toll of the Iraq War and the death toll of the Syrian and Libyan civil wars, I don't think you're going to find much of a difference. And so at the end of the day, the outcomes, even though the U.S. footprint was quote unquote smaller, is roughly the same. A completely devastated region from Tunisia to Iraq. It's just in complete free fall, and with military juntas, militias, and terrorist groups. And really, the Middle East, we forget the Middle East has always been prone to violence. But if you look back at the 80s and 90s specifically, the Middle East was a much more peaceful place. The Arab-Israeli wars had largely ended. There was the brief war in Lebanon, but it was a proxy war between Syria and Israel. It wasn't a direct war like the Syrian invasion of the Golan Heights in 73 and in 67. And of course, you had the Persian Gulf War and the Iran-Iraq War. That was the big exception, the 8-year war there. But the rest of the Middle East, North Africa, was largely stable and at peace. And now we're in a state of perpetual war in the Middle East, really beginning with the Arab Spring, all throughout the entire region, which is completely catastrophic. I mean, one can guess at how many lives have been destroyed, literally and figuratively, by these effects. And I think one of the key things to learn from 2003 and then 2011 is that in order to defeat this sort of imperialist agenda, one of the things that was pointed out over 30 years ago by Jeffrey Hummel in his lecture about the private production of defense is that, well, there was a certain measure of success in Cold War revisionist history by the likes of the New Left. It was only partial. And the reason why it was only partial is there had not been a successful revision of World War II policy. And as we saw with Slobodan Milosevic in Serbia and Saddam in Iraq and now ISIS in Syria, that they play the Hitler card. And the Hitler card still resonates even with many on the left in a way that throwing out the boogeyman of the Soviet Union might not. And I think Hummel was onto something very good. He's like that the revisionist narrative was incomplete. And the only way to completely challenge and convince the people that these narratives have no substance is to do a complete, thorough revision of U.S. policy in the 20th century. And until or unless that happens, I think he's absolutely correct that no meaningful domestic resistance to the American empire can be brought about. And U.S. interventions can be stopped. Syria, Obama numerous times made threatening moves on Syria, the line in the sand, Syria's got to get rid of the missiles, the chemical weapons. And in large part from domestic dissent, he didn't get the support he needed to go in. And it's like people were finally learning the lessons of Iraq. But the problem is, unless we have a consistent narrative of revision, people are likely to forget. You just takes a generation for people to forget what happened before. And so just like the Vietnam syndrome was forgotten when you got to the first Gulf War, give it 20, 25 years, and the Iraq War syndrome might be forgotten. And so we can't rely on just the memories of bad experiences. We have to rely on a coherent, well thought out narrative in the same way that the imperialists do. So what are your thoughts on that, Keith?
Yeah, well, I think all of the points you raised are good. When it comes to the record of the left, when it comes to U.S. imperialism, this is important because for those of us that grew up in the 70s and 80s, it was always the liberal end of the spectrum of the United States that was considered to be the anti-war party. And that had to do with the legacy of the war in Vietnam, where it was certainly the anti-Vietnam War movement was largely a movement of the left. And for a time after that, the American left had a very negative, very critical view of American interventionism. I was personally involved with the anti-war movement in the late 1980s over Central America, and certainly almost all of that was left dominated. You maybe found some libertarians here and there, but mostly it was Marxist, liberals, and the peace churches and all of that. Um, that started to change, ironically, with the Gulf War in 1991. I remember during that time, a lot of left luminaries were coming out in favor of the war, on collective security grounds and international law grounds and things like that. Including people who had been outspoken and even leading critics of the Vietnam War, like Tom Hayden, like Andrew Young, the civil rights leader. I think even George McGovern supported the Gulf War in '91, if I remember correctly. So that started a situation where the left once again started to move back towards its previous position of, I guess, what you could call liberal imperialism. The idea that came out of World War I of making the world safe for democracy and wars for human rights and defeat fascism and all of these kinds of things. I think what the real issue there was that the left was opposed to the war in Vietnam, and they were opposed to the Cold War. The left opposed American interventionism against communist regimes or leftist regimes or movements or insurgencies or whatever, but not against regimes that they considered to be fascist or right-wing or reactionary or whatever. In fact, I even in the 80s, I started noticing the left going in that direction. I started noticing people on the left calling for an invasion of Chile, the Pinochet, and overthrowing the Pinochet regime and all of that. So the left in the 1990s started moving back towards an interventionist position, and very much under the guise of spreading human rights and democracy. It was no longer about anti-imperialism. It was about the war for democracy against fascism. You saw that really ramping up when Bill Clinton went to war in Kosovo in 1999. And I remember seeing a lot of left publications like The Nation and all of that coming out in favor of the Kosovo War. As far as the Obama administration, this is important as well, because I would argue that the Obama administration was at least as awful in foreign policy as the George W. Bush administration was. And that's a pretty bold statement given the screw ups that happened under George W. Bush. But I agree with what you said, that the wars in Libya and Syria were just as awful as the war in Iraq and had just as little justification. While George W. Bush didn't build up a mass army of 150,000 Americans and then 100,000 foreign troops for the purpose of invading Iraq, while Obama didn't do that the way that George W. Bush did, the Obama administration was behind the insurgency in Syria against President Assad, and was certainly behind the overthrow of the Libyan government. And the results of those two wars have been absolutely as bad as anything that's happened in Iraq. I mean, in Iraq, we saw Iraq fall into a civil war and the subsequent rise of ISIS. That's exactly what happened in Syria, and it's exactly what happened in Libya. Ever since Gaddafi was overthrown in Libya, Libya has been broken up into multiple territories. Jihadis control most of those. ISIS has gained a foothold in that region as well, and then the costs in terms of casualties, in terms of poverty, in terms of disease and starvation, all of that has been about as bad in Libya and Syria as it has been in Iraq. So I don't really think that the foreign policy record of Barack Obama was any worse than the foreign policy record of George W. Bush. Now, I would also argue that Hillary Clinton, I think, had as much to do with that particular policy, the policies in Syria and in Iraq as Obama did. She was to the Obama administration what Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and the neocons were to the Bush administration. But the Obama administration was just a continuation of the Bush administration. I always like to say that Obama served George Bush's third and fourth terms for him, since he was constitutionally barred from doing so. Also, domestically, the Obama administration actually expanded the Patriot Act, They expanded all of the surveillance provisions that were implemented under George W. Bush under the War on Terrorism. They institutionalized and expanded that to an even greater degree under the National Defense Authorization Act back in 2011. So it was really no different. You know, the differences between the Obama administration and the Bush administration were all matters of style and cosmetics. George W. Bush had an image of being a conservative or a right winger or a Texan or something like that, and he liked to play to that. I mean, he tried to portray himself as being almost like a good old boy or a redneck or something like that. In reality, he was an upper class, son of extreme privilege and things of that nature. Whereas Obama was this, Harvard educated, articulate former law professor, first black president, all of those kinds of things. But there's not nearly as much difference in their policies as what some people would apparently believe. But what was interesting is the way that the anti-war movement in the United States completely dried up when Obama was elected. When Bush was building up for the war in Iraq in 2002 and 2003, there was a large anti-war movement in the United States. There were marches that would attract 100,000 people in places like Washington, D.C. You had individual cities and localities in the state, throughout the United States, that were issuing their own resolutions condemning the war in Iraq or condemning the Patriot Act even. Usually more left-leaning, more blue zone areas. I think a few states, maybe some local cities. None of that happened with Barack Obama's presidency, even though he pursued policies that were just as awful, in terms of domestic surveillance, civil liberties, in terms of foreign aggression, things of that nature. So I think that showed that the anti-war movement of the early 2000s was really an anti-Republican movement. It wasn't an anti-war movement. It was just something that the left was using as a front for advancing whatever other objectives they had, attacking the right or whatever. But the legacy of those two administrations, the Bush and the Obama administration, has largely been to just totally lay waste to the Middle East. Not only was there Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya, but as you pointed out, the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring largely had the effect of overturning relatively moderate, relatively secular regimes in places like Libya and contributing to the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Wahhabist groups. And I don't think all of that was just by blunder either. I think that the general foreign policy paradigm that the United States has wanted to pursue in the Middle East for quite some time is what you said earlier, and that is destabilization. A lot of people today don't understand that the condition that the Middle East is in at present can be traced all the way back to World War I, where there was the overthrow of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire had ruled that region for 300 years. They were certainly not Western liberals, but they had a relatively decent civilization by world historical standards. They had a relative degree of autonomy for different ethnic groups and religious communities, including Jews and Christians and all of that. And after the collapse of or overthrow of the Ottomans, the British imperialists essentially came in and carved up the Ottoman Empire into all these states with unnatural boundaries, where you had people of different ethnic and tribal and religious backgrounds forced under the same roof where they didn't belong together. And then the West, particularly the United States and England, started to support some of the most retrograde elements in the region, like the Wahhabist movement in Saudi Arabia. They installed the House of Saud as puppet rulers. And then the House of Saud largely let the Wahhabist clerics run Saudi Arabian society for them. And the West has continually supported these kinds of Islamist movements, and they've done so as a bulwark against secular nationalists. The main thing that the West has always opposed in the Middle East is the rise of secular nationalist movements, and that's why they were so opposed to Saddam Hussein, to Gaddafi, to Nasser, to the Assads, and to movements of that type. What they preferred were puppets. They preferred puppets, or at least or at least strong men that were going to uphold what they perceived to be Western interests, like the Shah of Iran or like Mubarak in Egypt, or like the Saudis or like the Gulf states. And it doesn't really matter to the Westerners what kind of regimes these are. I mean, they'll work with secular regimes like the Shah, or they'll work with Islamist regimes like the Saudis. You know, depending on what's most advantageous at the time. But a problem has been that the Westerners have always tried to either promote these Wahhabist movements as an alternative to secular Arab nationalism, or they have funded and backed states that in turn have funded these movements on the ground, which is what the Saudis and some of the other Gulf states do. They actually finance and bankroll a lot of these jihadi insurgent movements throughout the Middle East. And that's why the Middle East is in the kind of condition that it's in today. I don't think that the problem is the Middle Eastern people themselves. I mean, it's not that there are a lot of Westerners, particularly Americans, who look at the Middle Easterners and say, well, they're just really backward, retrograde, and inherently violent people. I don't really think that's the case as much as the fact that these are the kinds of things that various powers have promoted, Western powers and local regimes in the region as well.
Yeah. Yeah. With the thing is with this whole broader agenda of liberal imperialism, there's a really interesting debate. Interesting, not so much for the performance of Fareed Zakaria, but just for the points that are brought up. Niall Ferguson debates Fareed Zakaria on, is the liberal international order over? And Ferguson opens, he's sort of arguing that it is. He opens with a very interesting quote. He sort of rephrases Voltaire. The liberal international order is neither liberal nor international nor an order, which is a paraphrase of Voltaire's The Holy Roman Empire is neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. And he points out that what we see, this collapse of the unraveling of the order, is a result of a lot of factors. The sort of the fact that the neoliberal agenda has not done very well for a lot of the middle class people, the people who, in many ways, it was sold to. It's made a lot of people at the top very rich, and I suppose the redistribution, people at the bottom are happy enough. But the middle class feels cheated, which is and has given rise to a kind of economic populism, protectionism, which we saw in UK with Brexit, which we saw in the United States with the election of Donald Trump. It's no longer really providing security because of all these terrorist incidents that are happening throughout Europe and the United States due to unchecked, unvetted immigration. And it's not really even maintaining order anymore because the world is less safe and more insecure than it was in the 90s. One could even argue less safe and secure than it was in the 80s. As strange as that sounds with the Soviet threat of nuclear war, that aside, in many ways, it was more stable in the 80s. And I think if we project this out, what we're likely going to see is, due to the overextension of the U.S. imperial forces and due to the economic troubles that the United States is going through, we're going to see maybe not a complete withdrawal, but a world in where America is no longer the global hyperpower. It's going to be a gradual recession of American strength as new nations rise to challenge it effectively, China, Russia, possibly Iran in the Middle East, possibly other regions. People talk about Brazil and India becoming great powers in the next 10, 20, or 20, 25 years, 30 years, possibly. But I think we're going to see a world that's less safe, less secure than it was 20, 30 years ago. We're going to see a world where the United States is still going to be a powerful, influential force, but one that is going to be, on the one hand, relatively afraid of deploying large bodies of troops from the lessons that we learned from Iraq. The second Gulf War, a lot of popular unrest came from that, but still trying to maintain its grip on power. I imagine it's something like historical what we saw the collapse of the Habsburg Empire. The Habsburg Empire didn't really collapse all at once. It was fighting the Dutch in Holland. It was fighting the French in Italy. It was trying to attempt to invade England to overthrow Queen Elizabeth. It was trying to occupy and hold vast tracts of territory in the New World. And gradually what happened is, and it was also fighting the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean. It was vastly overstretched. And as new nations arose to challenge it, it couldn't effectively meet all challengers. And it ended up overcommitting, and gradually its strength was sapped away. And of course, this comes in, it's kind of coming full circle, because William Graham Sumner, one of the members of the American Anti-Imperialist League, in his essay, The Spanish Conquest of America, he talks just about how the Habsburgs did bankrupt themselves. And I think it's something kind of like that. I mean, the Habsburgs did not cease to become a great power overnight, and Spain was still a force to be reckoned with for centuries, but it was no longer the dominant superpower that it once had been. And I think the future is going to be something like that for America. It's going to take place over throughout the 21st century, and new nations like Russia and China and possibly India and Brazil and Iran will rise up to fill the vacuum. And it's going to be more destabilized in the sense that there's going to be this lack of faith in, especially in the West, of the secular governments, as you've pointed out, Keith, that and people like Bill Lind have pointed out, is that these regimes no longer seem to have the support of the people. They're not delivering on what they said they would deliver, which is sort of the beginning of the unraveling of the liberal order, the neoliberal order that was set up in place after the fall of the Soviet Union. No, will there be a complete collapse of the West, or an Islamic invasion of the West, or Europe's United States fragmenting? Those things, it's a bit difficult to telescope too far into the future. But I think we can say with some certainty that the future is going to be more unstable, and U.S. power won't be as effective as most Americans are accustomed to it. Historically, especially in the 20th century, with American intervention, we have a decisive conclusion. We go home, we're happy. Vietnam challenged that idea, but then the 1991 Gulf War seemed to reaffirm it. And then now the war on terror is undermining it again. And I think Americans are generally getting to the conclusion that American military activity, foreign policy, no longer produces the decisive results that we're used to and we're accustomed to. And again, I don't think we've been learning the correct lessons from these endeavors. And so as America continues to unsuccessfully try to use its power, and other nations rise up to challenge it, it's going to just generally be a more uncomfortable world than the world that the likes of Fukuyama predicted with their rose-colored glasses. So what are your thoughts on the short-term future?
Well, the way that the world order is evolving, I think many of the things you pointed out are certainly true, in the sense that American power seems to be receding. Back in the early 2000s, I noticed that the what's called the BRIC axis was rising. That is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and now the Shia bloc in the Middle East. You have the Iranian-led Shia bloc, which is basically Iran, and then the other parts of the Middle East that have a large Shia population. That bloc is now moving closer to the BRICS, and there's some evidence that the Iranians may eventually be incorporated into the BRICS as well. So I do see the Russians and the Chinese gaining a lot more influence in the Middle Eastern region in the future. In fact, I think one reason why the Americans are still so adamant about maintaining a presence in the Middle East, in spite of one failure after another, is because they don't want the Russians and the Chinese to gain any kind of hegemony there. They want to preserve that for themselves. But I do think, though, that the Russians and the Chinese are going to have a much bigger role in the Middle East in the future. Certainly, the Russians stepped in and helped to save the Assad regime. The Chinese are actually very interested in Afghanistan. They actually want to engage in a lot of development in Afghanistan. And then the Iranians are moving closer to the east as well. That's also happening in Africa. The Chinese in the last 15 to 20 years have been moving into Africa and engaging in a lot of resource development in Africa, which has actually been very beneficial to certain regions of Africa. There have been regions of Africa where the average income was, say, $300 a year, where now the average income has gone up to about $5,000 or $6,000 a year. So the actual standard of living in some areas of Africa where the Chinese have fostered trade and development has actually improved. In fact, that may be the one thing that finally lifts Africa out of its traditional extreme poverty is if the Chinese are able to move into Africa and help develop their economy. Of all the regions of the world today that live in extreme poverty, it's predominantly sub-Saharan Africa and rural India and other parts of South Asia. Those are the parts of the world where you still have pre-modern levels of poverty. So it may be that this is the thing that will finally help lift a lot of the African nations out of that kind of extreme poverty is through their relationship with the Chinese. But it is true that the center of power worldwide seems to be shifting towards the east, not only in the Middle East and in Africa, but even in Latin America. The United States once exercised near complete hegemony over Latin America. And as even people like Noam Chomsky or even President Assad of Syria recently mentioned, the United States largely has very limited influence in Latin America today, certainly nothing like what it once was. And many of the Latin American nations are themselves turning towards the east. They're starting to develop their own trade relationships and things like that with nations like China, like Russia. It's interesting how nations around the world are turning their backs on the United States. And even in Europe now, we see a fracturing of the relationship between the United States and Europe. We see, for example, some countries wanting to leave the EU. The British have already voted to leave from the EU. Now, in particular, with Donald Trump as the president, I think that's exacerbating the conflict between the United States and Europe. Because a lot of the Europeans just flat out don't like him. He's also mentioned at various points, probably with varying degrees of sincerity, that the Europeans need to start paying their share of NATO as well. So it may be that the United States and Europe also start to fall further apart. And one thing that you also mentioned that I think is important is that it seems to me that the United States is becoming a society where people just have zero interest in foreign military expeditions anymore. One of the things that came out of the Vietnam War, in fact, I think one of the most enduring aspects of the Vietnam War was the fact that it not only ended the draft, there hasn't been a draft in half a century now because of the Vietnam War, but ever since the war in Vietnam, Americans have simply been reluctant to support war if it means any sacrifices on their own side, any casualties, or certainly the things that happened in past times. Like during the big wars, like World War I, World War II, we had hundreds of thousands of, or even millions of people, even tens of millions of people drafted into the service. We had things like special war taxes and rationing of essential goods, hundreds of thousands of casualties. And there's no way that Americans would ever accept that today. In fact, the public opinion turned against the war in Iraq as soon as there were any casualties on the American side. And I don't see much evidence of that changing. In fact, if anything, I think it's probably more like that now than ever before. I know I saw a Pew Research poll done a few months ago where they were asking Americans what issues they thought were the most important. And foreign policy related issues were hardly even on the list. I mean, even stuff that you would think would be a big issue, like terrorism or like North Korea, maybe at the most, 1 in 20 Americans thought any of those issues were important. Americans were more concerned about the economy, about unemployment, about health care, about race relations, about immigration, about unsatisfactory government, about divisiveness in the domestic society. It seems like foreign policy issues just aren't really a problem or for most Americans right now. Now, of course, that could change if there was another big terrorist incident or something like that, or every time some terrible thing happens that's traced to ISIS or one of those groups, like the recent truck bombing in New York, or the guy at the gay nightclub in Florida last year, or when something like that happens in Paris or in the European city, sometimes the public concern about, say, terrorism will rise a bit, but that doesn't seem to be very durable. It seems that Americans are more interested in fighting with each other over domestic issues, over cultural issues, and things like that. And there's just no real taste for going to war or foreign policy adventurism. In fact, that's one of the things that seems to have helped Trump in the last election. I actually think Trump probably won in part because he got a substantial share of the anti-war vote, because with varying degrees of consistency. He presented himself as an anti-war candidate at least some of the time. Um, and I don't really see that changing much either. You know, I can't think of anything really that would turn public opinion around to where Americans are really excited about going to war. You know, even September 11th, you know, that only, you know, yeah, for a time after that happened, you had people putting up their flag, you know, their flags or their little wearing their flag lapel pins and things like that. But that wore off very quickly. I mean, as soon as you know, the war started and there were any actual casualties, that enthusiasm for that disappeared, and now there's zero enthusiasm for that. So I do think that what that shows is that the American state itself is losing its legitimacy, and certainly it's not a state that anybody wants to go to war on behalf of.
Yeah. We're about out of time. Is there anything you'd like to end with, Keith?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to perhaps take a look at what the future world order will be in the far distant future. And I do tend to think that the center of power is shifting towards the east, if for no other reason because that's where the population is. I mean, it's the Chinese and the Indians who have a third of the world's population between them. And India is also developing very rapidly economically. You know, Russia is no longer the decrepit Soviet economy. It's behind the West in terms of its development, but it's still comparable to a first world country, you know, perhaps one of the poorer European countries. And I think that this 500-year long Western dominance internationally is probably going to start coming to an end. And the West is going to assume the role that the East has for the past 5 centuries. And I think the real center of civilization is probably going to be in the East. You know, it's probably going to be China, Russia, India, some of these other places, Japan, these other places are really going to be the center of technology and development and trade and world power and things like that.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think one thing to end with is you mentioned how the U.S. Population seems really uninterested in fighting external threats. Kind of reminds me of the Russian population at the end of World War One. They really weren't interested in fighting for the Tsar anymore, but they once the Civil War it was engaged in, they were more than willing to fight each other. I think if the wrong or right, depending on your point of view, situation develops, that kind of attitude of fighting would be sort of sublimated into civil war, much like it was in Russia in 1917. But thanks for coming on, Keith. This is the end of our 8-part series on U.S. foreign policy. This is Todd Lewis signing off.